They called it Whispering Creek Estates, Phase 2, the waterfront villas. A monument to their own audacity, built on land they'd effectively stolen right out from under me. Land my grandfather, Josiah, had poured his soul into, not for profit, but as a steward. He'd always said, with that knowing glint in his eyes, that Whispering Creek had a memory longer than any man's, and a temper that, if provoked, could sweep away all foolishness in its path. The particular parcel they'd annexed, as their smarmy lawyer put it, was the most vulnerable. A low-lying basin where the old diversion dams my grandpa maintained were the only things keeping the creek from reclaiming its ancient floodplain during the spring thaws and summer downpours. I had inherited it all, the beauty, the burden, and his meticulous, hand-written journals detailing every repair, every near miss, every solemn promise to the land. This year, I'd finally scraped together the time and resources to begin the serious, long-overdue reconstruction of those crumbling earthen and timber sentinels. Then the Homeowners Association, from the sprawling, cookie-cutter development upstream, Serenity Heights, heard whispers of my plans. Whispers, I suspect, carried by the same surveyor I'd consulted. Suddenly, my quiet corner of the county became their prime expansion opportunity. And that's when my dam reconstruction project went from imminent to indefinitely postponed. A decision I shared with absolutely no one, least of all the incoming tide of entitled opportunists. My grandfather, Josiah Thorne, wasn't a rich man, not in the way the HOA board members of Serenity Heights would understand. His wealth was in the rustle of the cottonwoods along Whispering Creek, the intricate dance of dragonflies over the reed beds, and the deep, loamy scent of the earth after a rainstorm. He'd acquired the several hundred acres that included the basin, which we simply called the Hollow, back in the 40s, when it was considered marginal land, too prone to the creek's whims for reliable farming. But Gramps saw something else. He saw a sanctuary. He understood the delicate balance of the local ecosystem, how the seasonal flooding, when managed, nourished the land, and how, unmanaged, it could be a destructive force. The series of small, almost artisanal dams and levees he built and maintained weren't grand engineering marvels. They were works of respect, designed to guide the water, not conquer it. He'd patrol them weekly, patching muskrat holes with clay, clearing debris from the spillways, reinforcing weakened sections with rocks and timber hewn from his own woodlot. He taught me to read the language of the water, the subtle shifts in its color and flow, the way the air felt before a big storm. This land gives, but it also takes if you don't listen, he'd say, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. After he passed, the responsibility fell to me. I was younger then, busy establishing my own career in the city, a world away from the Hollow's quiet rhythms. I visited when I could, did my best with minor upkeep, but the dams needed more than a weekend warrior's touch. They needed the kind of sustained, knowledgeable care Gramps had given them. The county, despite the dams technically reducing flood risk for areas downstream, including, ironically, the land eventually developed into Serenity Heights, considered them private structures on private land and offered no assistance. "Not in our budget," was the perennial excuse. So they slowly eroded, season by season, their integrity a fading echo of my grandfather's diligence. This year, however, was supposed to be different. I'd taken an extended leave from work, consulted with a retired hydrological engineer who actually knew and respected Gramps' old methods, and had a crew lined up. My plan wasn't to turn the Hollow into some commercial venture, but perhaps a small, sustainable nature retreat, a place where people could learn about riparian ecosystems, or maybe just a well-managed conservation area, honoring Josiah's legacy. I envisioned workshops, walking trails that respected the wildlife, and ensuring those dams were not just repaired, but improved, using modern understanding combined with Gramps' time-tested principles. The thought of it filled me with a quiet joy, a sense of fulfilling a promise. I even found his old ledgers, detailing rainfall, flood levels, repair schedules, going back decades. They were a testament to his dedication, a blueprint for responsible stewardship. The land itself was magical. Ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss, hidden springs that fed into the creek, and an abundance of wildlife that had flourished under Gramps' largely hands-off, respectful approach. He'd often point out high water marks on trees from floods before his dams were fully effective, stories of water reaching halfway up the trunks of venerable sycamores. The creek remembers this height. He'd tap a discolored band of bark, and it'll try for it again if we let our guard down. The thought of those waters, untamed, was always in the back of my mind. A healthy respect he'd ingrained in me. The hollow wasn't just land, it was a living history, a responsibility, and a place that held the very essence of my grandfather's spirit. The initial consultations with the engineer had been promising. He'd been impressed by Gramps' intuitive understanding of water flow and suggested modern geomembrane cores for the earthen dams and reinforced concrete for the main spillways, all while maintaining the aesthetic and ecological sensitivity Gramps would have insisted upon. I'd started sourcing materials, getting quotes for heavy equipment, the whole 9 yards. It felt good, like I was finally stepping up, truly honoring his memory in a tangible way. The air, in the hollow, seemed to hum with anticipation. Or maybe that was just my own excitement. The first inkling I had that my quiet, well-intentioned plans were about to be bulldozed, literally, came not as a roar, but as a series of irritating, officious whispers. It started with a surprisingly glossy brochure tucked into my rural route mailbox, a mailbox Gramps had put up 50 years ago. Serenity Heights HOA, expanding our vision of community excellence, it proclaimed, featuring airbrushed images of smiling, homogeneous families picnicking by a suspiciously pristine, digitally enhanced version of what was clearly Whispering Creek, my creek. Then came the surveyor, not mine, but a new one, tramping along the far perimeter of the hollow, accompanied by a woman whose power suit and clipboard screamed, "Official busybody." This, I later learned, was Brenda McTavish, president of the Serenity Heights HOA, a woman whose ambition apparently knew no boundaries, including clearly marked property lines. I confronted them politely at first. "Excuse me," I said, walking out to meet them, my old work boots sinking slightly into the soft earth Gramps had tilled for his vegetable garden decades ago. "This is private property. Josiah Thorne's estate, to be precise. I'm his heir." Brenda McTavish, a woman whose blonde helmet of hair looked like it could withstand a Category 3 hurricane, gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which scanned my scruffy appearance with disdain. "Oh, we're aware," she said, her voice dripping with a syrupy condescension that instantly set my teeth on edge. "We're just conducting a preliminary assessment for potential common area enhancement, for the betterment of the entire community, of course." The surveyor, a nervous young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, avoided my gaze and kept fiddling with his GPS device. The betterment she spoke of, I soon discovered, involved a rather creative reinterpretation of century-old plat maps, a conveniently lost boundary marker, which I knew for a fact Gramps had reinforced with concrete just before he passed, and the assertion that a significant portion of the hollow, the very basin I was planning to protect, was actually an unclaimed riparian corridor that, by some arcane county ordinance they'd unearthed, defaulted to the oversight of the nearest established homeowners association, which, naturally, was theirs. Their lawyer, a shark named Bartholomew Hess, sent me a cease and desist letter thicker than a phone book, filled with convoluted legalese that basically amounted to, "This is ours now. Try and stop us." My own attorney, a decent small-town lawyer more accustomed to wills and minor disputes, looked grim. "They have deep pockets, these HOA types," he warned. "This could be a long, expensive fight. They're banking on you not having the stomach or the funds for it." He explained their angle. They'd found an ancient, ambiguous deed from the late 1800s that vaguely described a public access easement along the creek, an easement that was never formally recorded or exercised. By combining this with a modern zoning law about underutilized floodplains and their successful petition to the County Planning Commission, a commission where, I later found out, Brenda's husband held a non-voting but influential advisory seat, they had manufactured a claim. It was audacious. It was infuriating. It felt like grave robbery. All my carefully laid plans, the engineer, the materials, the respect I wanted to show my grandfather's legacy, felt like they were turning to ash in my mouth. I tried reasoning with them, attending one of their HOA meetings. It was like walking into a den of well-dressed wolves. Brenda presided, gavel in hand, a queen on her particle board throne. When I presented Gramps' journals, the old survey maps he'd meticulously preserved, even eyewitness accounts from old-timers who remembered Josiah working that land, they dismissed it all as anecdotal and emotionally driven. Hess, their lawyer, smirked throughout my presentation. "The law is the law, Mr. Thorne," he'd said, his voice smooth as oiled gravel. "And progress, as they say, waits for no man, nor for sentimental attachments to mud." The sheer arrogance was breathtaking. They spoke of unlocking the potential of the hollow, of providing luxury waterside amenities for their residents. They had no concept of what the land truly was, of its fragility, its power, or the quiet dedication it had taken to keep it in balance. They saw a blank canvas for their soulless development, a line item on their expansion budget. The injustice of it burned a cold, hard knot in my stomach. They weren't just stealing land. They were erasing history, spitting on my grandfather's memory. And they were so damn smug about it. The bulldozers arrived on a misty Monday morning, their guttural roar tearing through the dawn chorus of birdsong that usually filled the hollow. It felt like a physical violation. I stood on the edge of my remaining property, a helpless observer to the desecration. They started by clearing the very trees Gramps had planted as windbreaks, ancient willows and sturdy maples reduced to mulch in hours. Brenda McTavish was there, naturally, wearing a hard hat that looked comically oversized on her, directing the chaos with sweeping, imperious gestures. She even had the gall to wave at me, a bright, false smile plastered on her face, as if we were friendly neighbors embarking on a joint beautification project. I didn't wave back. My attempts to get a legal injunction had been stonewalled, delayed by Hess's procedural machinations until it was too late. He'd filed so many counter-motions and requests for discovery, citing my vexatious litigation, that my lawyer advised the costs were becoming prohibitive for an uncertain outcome, especially against their well-funded legal team. The county, swayed by promises of increased property tax revenue and controlled development, had rubber-stamped the HOA's plans with alarming speed. I showed them Gramps' flood journals, pages filled with his spidery handwriting detailing water levels, storm intensities, and the near breaches of the dams over 70 years. I pointed out the high water marks still visible on the older trees on my side of the now disputed line, marks that were alarmingly high. "This area floods," I told the blank-faced county planner. Seriously, floods. Those old dams your HOA friends are ignoring won't hold a major surge without the work I was about to do. He'd given me a patronizing smile. Mr. Thorne, Serenity Heights has provided us with comprehensive hydrological surveys from a very reputable engineering firm. They assure us their development includes state-of-the-art drainage solutions. Besides, he'd added, lowering his voice conspiratorially, a little waterfront ambiance is good for property values, isn't it? State-of-the-art drainage, I thought, for a natural floodplain? That was like putting a screen door on a submarine. It was then, watching a particularly venerable oak that Gramps had called Old Man Weatherby crash to the ground, that the cold knot of anger in my gut coalesced into something else, a quiet, chilling resolve. My plans for dam reconstruction, the ones I'd so eagerly pursued, suddenly seemed premature. Why should I fortify the very structures that might, in their current, neglected state, offer a natural corrective to this egregious theft? The irony was not lost on me. They were building their flimsy paradise in the exact spot Gramps had always called the soaker. The lowest point, the first to go when the creek got ornery. He'd spent his life preventing that. Perhaps it was time for a brief educational lapse in that prevention. I didn't actively sabotage anything. I wouldn't. That wasn't my way, and it wouldn't have honored Gramps. But the careful, meticulous inaction? That was a different story. I had already paid the initial consultation fee to my chosen engineer, Mr. Henderson, a man who knew Gramps and understood the land. I called him. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice carefully neutral. Something's come up. A rather aggressive development. I'm going to have to put the dam project on hold indefinitely. Personal reasons. He was disappointed. I could hear it in his voice. That's a real shame, son. Your grandpa's work up there. It needs seeing to. That creek won't wait forever. I know, sir, I replied. Believe me, I know. I didn't tell him why. I didn't tell anyone. I simply stopped. The quotes for materials went unanswered. The calls to the equipment rental company were never returned. The allocated funds sat in my bank account, gathering a pittance of interest. Instead, I took to observing. From the bluffs on my undisputed property, I had a clear view of their frenetic, destructive activity. They were moving fast, too fast, throwing up prefabricated frames on hastily poured concrete slabs that looked woefully inadequate for the soft, alluvial soil. I saw no signs of the state-of-the-art drainage the county planner had prattled on about, unless he meant the undersized culvert they'd shoved under the new access road. A culvert that would be overwhelmed by a moderate summer shower, let alone a real flood. Each evening, I'd walk the perimeter of what was left of my heritage, and then, sometimes, I'd make my way, carefully, unseen, to the old dams themselves. They were looking worse than ever. Winter ice and spring melt had taken their toll. One of the smaller earthen levees had a significant slump, a long, deep crack down its center. The main timber spillway Gramps had rebuilt in the 70s was showing rot in its foundational beams. It was, to put it mildly, a disaster waiting to happen. And I, the one person who knew every weak point, every historical vulnerability, every trick to shoring them up, just observed, documented, and waited. The plans for Whispering Creek Estates, Phase 2, the waterfront villas, were, I managed to glimpse from a discarded blueprint at the edge of their site, laughably unsuited to the terrain. They featured walkout basements in an area where the water table was barely 3 feet below the surface in a dry year. Picture windows faced the creek, offering what their brochure called unparalleled views of nature's majesty, soon to be unparalleled views of nature's fury. It was a monument to ignorance and greed, rising from the stolen soil of my grandfather's legacy. And as I watched them build, I began to understand that my inaction was not just passive resistance. It was the only voice the land itself had left. The construction of the waterfront villas proceeded with a speed that was alarming, even from my vantage point. It was as if Brenda McTavish and her HOA cronies were trying to outrun some unseen deadline. Perhaps the nagging voice of common sense, or more likely, the inevitable arrival of the late summer rainy season, a period Gramps always eyed with cautious respect. Frame by frame, cheaply clad siding by cheaply clad siding, their luxury resort took shape. I saw them cutting corners everywhere. Insulation was minimal. Foundations looked shallow, and the landscaping consisted of rolling out sod onto poorly graded dirt. Sod that would offer zero resistance to moving water. They even started pre-selling units with glossy signs promising tranquil waterside living, coming soon. Tranquil, I thought, was one word for it. Submerged was another that came to mind. I made it a point to walk the old dam line regularly, always from my side of the now fiercely defended by them property boundary. The deterioration was accelerating. The slump in the earthen levee I'd noticed earlier had widened, and small rivulets of water were now constantly seeping through its base, even with the creek at its normal summer level. The main spillway creaked ominously with the slightest breeze. I took photographs, meticulous, dated, geotagged, not for them, not anymore, for my own records. For the inevitable I told you so that I knew was coming, though I would likely never utter it aloud. The summer progressed, hot and humid. The Serenity Heights residents, oblivious, would sometimes wander down the new, poorly constructed path towards their future waterfront amenities, pointing and chattering excitedly. I overheard snippets of their conversations. "Can you imagine the kayaking? Brenda said the fishing here is fantastic." Fishing, I mused, might indeed be fantastic when the creek decided to visit their living rooms. Brenda herself was a frequent presence, often seen striding about the site, micromanaging the construction crews, her voice, sharp and commanding, carrying across the water. She once spotted me watching from my property line and yelled something about loitering with intent, which was rich, considering her entire project was built on stolen land and ill intent. I just gave her a slow, deliberate nod and continued my observation. My internal state was a curious mixture. The initial burning rage had cooled into a sort of icy calm, a patient, detached anticipation. There was no malice in it, not exactly. It was more a profound sense of karmic inevitability. They had been warned, repeatedly, by me, by history, by the very lay of the land itself. They had chosen arrogance and greed over prudence and respect. The universe, or at least Whispering Creek, had a way of balancing such equations. I found myself poring over Gramps' journals again, not for dam repair techniques this time, but for his accounts of past floods. August 1958. One entry read, 3 days solid rain. Creek rose 12 feet in 6 hours. Old Man Hemlock's bottom pasture completely under. Dams held, but barely. Spillway 1 took a beating. Another from 1972, after Hurricane Agnes, detailed water lapping at the very top of the main levee, a level that would have put their waterfront villas completely underwater. These weren't just stories, they were data points, warnings etched in ink and experience. As July bled into August, the traditional start of our region's most intense thunderstorm season, the air grew thick and heavy. The sky often took on a bruised purplish hue in the afternoons. The frogs in the hollow, usually a boisterous chorus, grew strangely silent. An old country sign Gramps had taught me meant heavy rain was imminent. The HOA, meanwhile, was planning a grand pre-opening gala for their new resort, scheduled for the Labor Day weekend. Invitations, I heard through the county grapevine, were highly sought after. They were even stringing up fairy lights around the nearly completed clubhouse, its large glass windows reflecting the ominous sky. I watched them, these preparations for a party on the lip of a precipice, and felt a profound sense of the absurd. It was like watching children build a magnificent sandcastle directly in the path of an incoming tide, utterly oblivious to the power about to be unleashed. One afternoon, a particularly dark set of clouds gathered upstream. A short, violent squall hit, lasting no more than an hour. It wasn't a major event, just a typical summer storm. But the creek, already swollen from a wetter-than-average July, responded quickly. I saw water backing up against their undersized access road culvert, creating a temporary pond that lapped at the manicured lawns of the nearest villas. The site manager, a harried-looking man I'd seen Brenda berating on several occasions, was out with a crew, frantically trying to clear debris from the culvert. They managed, eventually, but not before a few of the newly laid sod patches were washed away, leaving muddy scars. Brenda arrived later, surveyed the minor damage with a dismissive sniff, and was overheard telling the manager to get it sorted before the gala. Appearances are everything. That little episode, a mere dress rehearsal for what was potentially coming, seemed to teach them nothing. If anything, it made them double down on the aesthetics, replanting the sod, adding more mulch, more flowers, as if to prettify away the inherent danger. My own preparations were simple. I checked the batteries in my weather radio. I ensured my generator was fueled. I moved Gramps' most precious belongings, his journals, his old tools, his photograph albums, from the ground floor of my small cabin, which was on higher ground but still closer to the creek than I liked in such conditions, to the attic. Not out of fear for my own property, which was well above any projected floodline he'd ever recorded, but out of respect. The land was preparing to speak, and I wanted to be a respectful audience. The last week of August arrived with a suffocating stillness. The air was a damp, heavy blanket, and the sky remained a perpetual, sullen gray. The weather forecasters started talking about a tropical depression forming in the Gulf, slow-moving and moisture-laden, with a potential track that could bring significant rainfall to our region. On the Serenity Heights HOA website, Brenda posted a chirpy update about the upcoming Enchanted Evening by the Creek Gala, complete with a CGI rendering of the clubhouse illuminated against a starry sky. A sky that bore no resemblance to the glowering reality hanging over us. She even mentioned enhanced drainage measures that had supposedly been implemented, a claim so patently false it was almost laughable. I knew for a fact the only enhancement was an extra layer of mulch around the wilting petunias. The first rains began on the Thursday before Labor Day weekend. Not the violent downpour of a thunderstorm, but a persistent, soaking drizzle that Gramps used to call a settling rain, the kind that saturates the ground deeply, leaving it with no capacity to absorb more. It rained all day Thursday, all through the night, and continued unabated into Friday. Whispering Creek, normally a clear, placid stream at this time of year, began to change. It turned murky, the color of weak tea, then coffee, and its voice grew from a gentle murmur to a restless growl. I walked to my usual vantage point. The water level was visibly higher, already lapping at the lowest point of the pathetic riprap they'd installed along the bank in front of the villas. The seepage from the old earthen dam had become a steady flow, a miniature waterfall cascading down its face. The crack had widened further. I could see daylight through parts of it. Friday afternoon, the county issued a flood watch for low-lying areas along all major creeks and rivers. I saw a county sheriff's vehicle drive slowly down the access road to the nearly completed resort, lights flashing. An officer spoke to the site manager, gesticulating towards the rising creek. They left after a few minutes. Later, I saw a small crew from the construction company half-heartedly placing a few sandbags around the clubhouse entrance. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with a child's beach pail. The rain intensified Friday night, now mixed with periods of torrential downpours. The wind picked up, lashing the trees, and the sound of the creek became a constant, angry roar that vibrated through the ground. I barely slept, listening to the storm and the voice of the water, a voice my grandfather had known so well. By Saturday morning, the day of the gala, the scene was dramatic. The creek was a raging brown torrent filled with debris, small branches, leaves, unsettling amounts of upstream soil. It had breached its normal banks and was already inundating the lowest parts of the hollow, the areas directly in front of the waterfront villas. The meticulously laid sod was submerged, looking like a series of lumpy green islands in a muddy lake. Water was halfway up the picture windows of the nearest units. Still, there was activity. A catering truck, looking hopelessly out of place, tried to navigate the partially flooded access road, its driver clearly regretting his decision. A few brave, or perhaps foolish souls in formal wear were seen arriving, only to turn back in dismay. The fairy lights around the clubhouse flickered and died. Around noon on Saturday, I heard it. A sound distinct from the roar of the creek and the drumming of the rain. A deep, guttural groan, followed by a sucking whoosh. It was the sound of earth giving way, of water unleashed. I grabbed my binoculars. The old earthen levee, Gramps' northernmost sentinel, the one with the pronounced slump and the widening crack, was gone. Not crumbling, not slowly eroding, it had simply vanished, a huge section of it torn away as if by a giant hand. A colossal wave of brown water, thick with mud and debris, surged through the breach, not into the old floodplain it used to gently irrigate, but directly, unerringly, towards the heart of Whispering Creek Estates, Phase 2. It was a terrifying, awe-inspiring sight. The water advanced with incredible speed, a churning, unstoppable wall. It hit the first line of villas with a percussive impact I could feel even from my distant perch. Windows shattered, walls buckled. The flimsy, prefabricated structures seemed to melt into the deluge. The state-of-the-art drainage was nowhere to be seen. Or perhaps it was simply performing an impeccable imitation of a large brown lake. The newly paved parking lot vanished in seconds. The clubhouse, set slightly higher, resisted for a few moments longer. Then water poured through its broken windows, its grand entrance, now a gaping maw swallowing the flood. I saw furniture, new, expensive-looking furniture, bobbing out through the shattered patio doors. The entire basin, the stolen heart of the hollow, was transformed into a raging appendage of Whispering Creek. There was no finesse to it, no gentle rise. It was a raw, brutal reclamation. I watched, my face impassive, the rain plastering my hair to my head. There was no triumph, no joy, just a profound, solemn sense of inevitability. This was not my doing, not directly. I had merely chosen not to intervene in a natural process that their arrogance had massively exacerbated. The land was speaking, and its language was water and fury. The creek, as Gramps had always warned, was remembering its old ways, and it was clear that those ways did not include Serenity Springs Resort. The rain finally eased by Sunday morning, though Whispering Creek remained a swollen, angry beast for several more days. As the waters slowly began to recede from the surrounding land, the full extent of the devastation at what was once proudly marketed as Whispering Creek Estates, Phase 2, became horrifyingly clear. It wasn't a resort anymore. It was a swamp, a demolition site, curated by nature. The waterfront villas were a collection of broken shells, some tilted at crazy angles, others simply foundations swept clean. Walls were gone, roofs caved in, and the interiors were choked with mud, uprooted trees, and the sad detritus of shattered dreams and cheap construction. The brand new clubhouse looked like it had aged a century in a single weekend, its large windows blown out, its expensive fixtures coated in a thick layer of silt. The meticulously landscaped grounds were a quagmire, littered with everything from mangled HVAC units to soggy, champagne-soaked remnants of gala decorations. The access road was washed out in 3 places. It was, in a word, annihilated. News crews arrived, of course, filming the wreckage from a safe distance, interviewing shell-shocked HOA officials and the few unfortunate early investors who had placed deposits on these phantom homes. Brenda McTavish, her power suit replaced by a rain slicker and a haunted expression, her helmet hair finally defeated, could only offer stammering platitudes about unforeseeable acts of God and unprecedented weather events. I almost snorted. Unforeseeable? Only to those who willfully chose not to see. Unprecedented? Gramps' journals were filled with precedents. Bartholomew Hess, the smug lawyer, was conspicuously absent from the press conferences, likely already buried in lawsuits and insurance claims, or trying to figure out how to blame the county, or me, or perhaps the beavers for the faulty dam. The county officials, who had so eagerly greenlit the project, were now backpedaling furiously, talking about rigorous reviews and lessons learned. There was even talk of a potential investigation into the permitting process and the adequacy of the HOA's submitted environmental impact reports, which I knew had been laughably optimistic. My own property, higher and thankfully untouched by the main floodwaters, beyond some soggy low spots near my own small, well-maintained culverts, became an ironic vantage point for the disaster tourists. I put up private property, no trespassing. Signs, not out of malice, but because I had no interest in their morbid curiosity or their inevitable questions. My peace had been disturbed enough. In the weeks that followed, the true cost began to emerge. The construction company declared bankruptcy. The insurance company, citing gross negligence in site selection and construction standards, was rumored to be denying most of the HOA's claims. Lawsuits flew like angry hornets, from the HOA against the county, from the would-be villa owners against the HOA, from the construction company's creditors against everyone. Serenity Heights itself was in turmoil, facing massive financial liabilities and the very real prospect of crippling special assessments on its existing homeowners to cover the losses. Brenda McTavish resigned in disgrace. The beautiful, stolen basin of the Hollow, however, was slowly beginning its recovery. The receding waters left behind a thick layer of fertile silt, the kind of natural nourishment Gramps had always valued. The broken remnants of the villas were an eyesore, yes, but beneath them, the land was still there, patient and resilient. Eventually, after months of legal wrangling and public outcry, the county, under pressure and facing its own share of liability, condemned the ruined structures. The HOA, now a shadow of its former arrogant self and financially crippled, had no choice but to cede the land back, not to me directly at first, but into a kind of conservatorship, with the understanding that a long-term, ecologically sound solution was needed. My lawyer, the small-town guy who'd initially been so pessimistic, actually managed to negotiate a brilliant outcome. Given my documented prior ownership, my grandfather's historical stewardship, and my still valid plans for sustainable management, which I dusted off at the appropriate moment. I was eventually able to reclaim full title to the Hollow, ostensibly for a nominal sum to cover administrative costs, but in reality, because no one else wanted the liability or possessed a credible plan for its future. The first thing I did was walk the land, truly walk it, from one end to the other. The scars were deep, but the spirit of the Hollow, the spirit Gramps had nurtured, was still there. The birds were returning. New green shoots were already pushing through the silt. As for the dams, well, the main one that had failed so spectacularly was beyond simple repair. Its failure, however, had demonstrated unequivocally to the county and even state agencies the critical role these seemingly minor structures played in regional flood control. Suddenly, there was talk of public funding, of a collaborative effort to rebuild and maintain the entire system, not just for my land, but for the protection of everyone downstream. I will, of course, be central to that discussion, armed with Gramps' journals and my own hard-won experience. The future of the Hollow will not be Whispering Creek Estates, Phase 2. It will be something quieter, something more respectful, perhaps the nature retreat I once envisioned, or simply a well-tended sanctuary. The water, after all, had spoken, and this time people were finally, reluctantly, listening. My grandfather, I think, would have understood my period of calculated inaction. He knew the creek had its own justice, and as I stood there, looking out over the slowly healing land, I felt a quiet sense of peace, a profound, if somber, vindication. The land was home again,